On the 7th of September 2012, Gregory Maxwell broadcasted a Bitcoin transaction in which he sent 21 million Bitcoins to himself. The transaction was genuine, however, it is not present in the blockchain anymore today. So how did he do it? But before that, let's take a look at the transaction. Here we have a screenshot of the old blockchain.info block explorer, which today is called blockchain.com, where we can see the transaction. The transaction is sent to a Bitcoin address that starts with the string gmaxwell. This is a vanity address. You can generate one of these yourself. It's not as hard as you may think. It just takes a bit of time. So it's not actually the impressive part. The impressive part comes here from the amount, which we can see it says 21 million Bitcoins. So this opens two questions right now. First of all, how did he manage to create this transaction? There is no way he actually owned or owns 21 million Bitcoins. But more importantly, how did he manage to fool the block explorer to show this as a transaction that is unconfirmed but totally valid? But before this, how do we know this transaction belongs to Gregory Maxwell? Well, in 2016, he made a Reddit comment where he was talking about the trust model in different types of Bitcoin nodes, and he was trying to make a point that SPV wallets are totally unreliable. And the SPV wallets are just a type of Bitcoin node that doesn't download the blockchain, and because it doesn't download the blockchain, it requires a bit more trust and it's easily to fool. Of course, this is not what we're seeing here. This is not an SPV wallet. He's just using this examples as a parallel to SPV wallets. But anyway, so how did he create this transaction? And the answer is more simpler than you think. He created the transaction by hand. What do I mean by this? Well, when you create a Bitcoin transaction, you probably use a Bitcoin wallet, and you go into your Bitcoin wallet, you type the amount and where do you want to send the Bitcoins to, and the Bitcoin wallet is going to create the Bitcoin transaction. It's going to write it up. But all Bitcoin transaction is just a very long string of numbers and letters. Here we have an example of a Bitcoin transaction that I found on a mempool right now. And it looks like there's a lot of gibberish, but if we were to decode a transaction, we can see that each of the fields has a specific meaning. So writing a transaction by hand is not as hard as you may think. It's just a bit of a tedious process. So that's exactly what Gregory Maxwell did. He took a transaction and he just modified the output and he wrote 21 million Bitcoins there. This is the same as you would write a check and you send to yourself $1 billion. It doesn't matter if you don't have $1 billion. There's no one that's going to stop you from writing $1 billion on the sender's amount. However, if you were to take this check to the bank would do some verifications and you will realize that you don't actually have in your account $1 billion and the check would be deemed invalid. And this is pretty much the same thing that's happening here with a Bitcoin transaction. So if you were to try to broadcast the transaction back then or right now, it would be deemed invalid by other nodes and it wouldn't be confirmed to the blockchain. However, the question remains, how did he manage to convince the block explorer to display the transaction as if it is valid and unconfirmed? Well, you see a lot of block explorers even today have this functionalities where they allow you to broadcast the transaction, which means that you take the transaction in that raw form that we showed earlier and you submit it to them, and then they're gonna broadcast it through their node. And the reason you may do this is because you don't want the network to see your node's IP. However, of course, the trade-off is that the block explorer sees your node, but you could obfuscate that in some way. But anyway, so here is where the problem comes from. You have to remember this was back in 2012 and the Bitcoin ecosystem was quite green and the blockchain.info block explorer wasn't doing all the checks. You see, when you paste this transaction here, it would only check if this is a Bitcoin transaction, but not if it's a valid Bitcoin transaction. Meaning that it would check that if all the fields are in the right places, but it wouldn't do any verifications on the data that is inside the fields like a node would do. So even though this seems to be like a valid Bitcoin transaction on the surface, as soon as a node would do certain verifications, you would realize this transactions that would not exist. The most important check that a node does, it is verifies that the inputs that you have in a transaction actually do exist and are spendable. It does this in the UTXO set. You see a Bitcoin node, a Bitcoin core node at least, maintains two databases. It has the blockchain with all the data in it, and then it has another database only of the outputs. Now you may think this is redundant, but the reason he's doing that is because the UTXO set, the output database, is just smaller and it's just faster to look for it. So every time a node needs to check if the Bitcoins you are spending are valid, it just looks at this database that just contains the outputs. And of course, after each block, this database is updated. So if you were to broadcast this transaction to a node, even now or then, the node would look in the UTXO set, it would see that there's no output that contains 21 million Bitcoins, and it would deem the transaction as invalid, and it wouldn't share it with other nodes in the network. But even more so, the Bitcoin node has other preliminary checks, which are not necessarily consensus bound like this one. And if a transaction has some weird things, it would be rejected. So this transaction would have been rejected anyway. So the problem was that the broadcasting transaction function in the blockchain.info block explorer was just too rudimentary. And that's why Gregory Maxwell was able to get this transaction to look like it's valid but unconfirmed. Now you might be wondering, wondering what is the big deal with this, because besides making a transaction that kind of looks weird and just displaying it for maybe a few minutes on the block explorer, what harm could this cause? Well, one way which you could exploit this would be to try to buy something from someone. Of course, you would use an amount that wouldn't raise alarm bells like 21 million Bitcoins, and you could tell him that you made a transaction, it's unconfirmed, and it's going to confirm soon, and you would ask him to send you the goods that you're trying to buy from him. And he gives you the goods, you go away, and then the transaction never gets confirmed. And of course, the main lessons here are to never, ever, ever consider an unconfirmed transaction as finalized, but more importantly, always verify transactions when you're receiving Bitcoin on your own node. If you would have tried to verify this transaction back then on your node would have deemed this transaction as invalid, but even more so, you would have not seen it in the mempool. So Gregory Maxwell didn't exploit a flaw in Bitcoin here, he exploited a flaw in the block explorer. Of course, something like this couldn't be done today anymore because all block explorers probably do more checks. If you like this video, please give it a like and a retweet, and if you want to see more videos like this one about weird Bitcoin historical factoids, make sure to follow me because more videos are coming. Also, I want to let you know that a while ago, I did this forensics investigation into Bitcoin's launch and I made some crazy discoveries. Turns out that Hal Finney and Dustin Trammell were way more important into Bitcoin's launch than you may imagine. Thank you for watching.